And if you've been following the NFL controversy, you know that there's been talk of fining teams if their players take the knee. And if this, of course, goes back to the movement started by Colin Kaepernick to take a knee in support of Black Lives Matter. And that has created a great controversy. But all these controversies exist at the center of a matrix of events and forces that I think our next guest has touched on very well. And that includes culture, that includes capitalism, that includes history, that includes perhaps even a spiritual dimension. But in any case, we'll talk about that with her. Elizabeth Bruenig is an opinion columnist for the Washington Post. She focuses on politics, religion, and morality in public life. And she wrote a piece that caught my eye recently for Medium.com entitled The Soulless Logic of Capitalism's Dark Satanic Mill and What It Tells Us About the NFL's National Anthem Policy. So she joins us now. First of all, Elizabeth, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
And secondly, I should have asked you this before we went on the air. Do you prefer to be called Elizabeth?
Liz is fine.
Liz, okay. Well, I'm Richard, or RJ, or hey you. Okay, so basically your thesis, rather than me tell it, just briefly, you mentioned the phrase dark satanic mills comes from the poem by William Blake, Jerusalem. Now, what is your thesis? I don't want to paraphrase it and get it wrong.
So, I mean, I pulled the phrase from Blake because Blake is this wonderful romantic. And so, you know, he's writing in the 19th century when the Industrial Revolution is really taking off and capitalism is getting off the ground. And so when he's talking about these dark satanic mills that have taken over sort of England's, you know, previously green pastoral countrysides, what he has in mind are these sort of like smoke belching factories. You know, people are coming off of these family farms that they've spent generations on and instead going to work in these really dangerous and kind of very, very dispiriting conditions, right, where they're breathing in dangerous chemicals, smoke, and having ashes and sparks spewed in their faces all day in the bellies of these enormous factories. That's the dark satanic mill he has in mind. And that's the sort of physical characteristics of capitalism that bothered those early romantics who were writing about it. But I think that there's another kind of like dark mill at work of a specifically satanic character in capitalism. And you take satanic to mean, you know, a kind of bargain, like a devil's bargain, where you always get less than what you bargained for. And you take a mill to be something that just sort of grinds and grinds and grinds everything down to a uniform substance. And capitalism works in that way. And it works in that way on things of a kind of spiritual or traditional or customary nature. And one of those things, funnily enough, is patriotism. Or anything that you might associate with a kind of transcendent love of country or nation, which is where you find a funny little tangle with the NFL, right? Is you see capitalism in competition with this, you know, what should be a kind of transcendent or overarching or very supreme love of country, and you see capitalism win the day.
Well, you know, I think the reference to the Industrial Revolution and this notion of the dark satanic mills, dark in the spiritual sense, also dark because of the they were darkening the sky with their smoke and so on. It is a great metaphor for the darkening of the spirit that occurs when people's humanity or independence or volition is made subordinate to the imperatives of capital, to the imperatives of wealth production, particularly when we're employees. And one of the reasons why I am a sucker also for an industrial revolution reference is that I think we're in the midst of something like the Industrial Revolution, which is to say a socially transformative new level of application of capitalism. And I think it's insufficiently understood. So I think that your point was well taken. I think what you were really, among other things, you were really saying that this shadow of this belching smoke of capitalism is eclipsing the ability of these NFL players to express themselves in a free way. Is that fair? Am I sort of getting it right?
Capitalism begins to be this overarching force that exerts itself over everything. So it exerts itself over the ability of even people who, so the people who are in favor of the NFL penalty. So you think of the ultra-patriotic football dads who are like, yes, they should force Colin Kaepernick to stand, and every other football player who wants to protest, they should make them stand up and honor our country. The only arguments they're able to field right now are arguments that, well, these people are at work and their bosses are telling them to do something, so they ought to do it.
Right.
So,
well, go ahead.
So even when it comes to sort of like higher level country and these things that should be sort of transcendent and true, they're not even able to argue for them. All they're able to argue for is the supreme power of the boss in the workplace. So they're not even able to argue anymore for the things that they really love. They're only able to argue that greater power be given to capital. And likewise, the ability of the NFL players to protest, to be able to actually field their expression and their arguments, again, for a higher civic good, is being contained, is being cramped, again, not by any good related to anything. It's not even a substantive good. It's pure capital.
Well, and we're talking with Elizabeth Bruenig, who is columnist for the Washington Post, but we're talking about a piece in Medium. And I think one of the reasons why this is so important, Liz, is because so much that's part of our individual flourishing as human beings and our collective flourishing as a society is not wealth producing for capital. It exists independently of that. That's something this nation, the United States of America, at various times has understood as a society, that we are not subservient to the production of wealth. I'm tempted to quote, in fact, I'm going to quote another William Blake poem where he said that, where he talked about the price of experience. He said, wisdom is sold in the desolate market where none come to buy. So if the NFL players are in fact wise, and I believe that they are, I think you do too, then that wisdom has to be made available in something other than a market. We have to acknowledge that speech has an inherent value, that ethics have inherent value, that ideals have an inherent value, and that may mean pushing back on, and does mean at times pushing back on the imperatives of capitalism. But that somehow, to me, other than your piece, and maybe only your piece, frankly, I haven't really seen that brought up as a broader issue, whether in terms of the NFL or anything else, that, you know, there are other things that matter, and we should be emphasizing those. I mean, I could name philosophers like John Dewey or whatever, but basically the gist is what happened to the idea that speech itself, education itself, ideals themselves matter independent of their financial impact.
Right, or that human beings are creatures who have needs that can't just be met by markets.
Right.
That in fact, if you try to meet them through markets, the product that you get out of the market loses its inherent value by being marketed, right? That people need to have their needs that are emotional or spiritual met in ways that are non-commodified.
Right. No.
This has to do with the kind of goods that we get out of civic participation together, and again, out of education that is non-commodified, the kind of wisdom we get from forms of apprenticeship and learning we do from one another. This is especially important in forms of citizenship and civic participation, and family life and spiritual growth. And I think that capitalism just doesn't have any use for those kinds of things, and that's why they sound very old-fashioned to us now, because there's no way to market them, there's no way to commodify them. Capitalism doesn't have a use for them, so they sound retrograde, because there's no way to make them relevant to modern life, because it's totally dominated by capital.
You know, here's another quote from the Industrial Revolution. The social critic and art critic John Ruskin said,
Beautiful man, yeah.
pardon me?
He's a beautiful man, beautiful soul, Ruskin.
Yes, he was, and I suspect you know the quote where he said, and he was speaking of something specific, which was the mechanization of a human being when they have to work in a factory or mill and do the same motions over and over. But it has a broader implication too when he said, and of course it's the gendered language of the time, but he said, you may make a man of the creature or you may make a tool of the creature, but you cannot do both. In other words, that as a society we have to decide, are we tools or are we human beings? And the imperative of finance, of capital, is that we should become tools. And, you know, it's very easy when you look back at the Industrial Revolution and a person is turning a crank or whatever 1,000 times a day, it's very easy to see how that person is a tool. But in a sense, we're making tools of NFL players if they're not permitted to express themselves by taking a knee. In a sense, many of us in our daily lives are made tools of. If we work at a place where our motions are tracked on our iPhone or our calls are tracked, if we use the company phone, or we're allowed 2 bathroom breaks a day and no more, or, I mean, we could go on and on and on, but I would say many of us, including those of us who have professional lives and may think of ourselves as professionals, may find that we're being turned by what you describe, I think, as the soulless logic of capitalism into tools. We as creatures are becoming tools rather than human beings in ways we may not even perceive. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy to see in sort of traditional Marxist language how you become alienated from your labor when you're doing sort of traditional industrial work. Like you're saying, sort of you're working on an assembly line producing a product with which you have zero relationship, and you're sort of doing the same motion over and over again, participating in building this product. But likewise, you can be really alienated from yourself in the process of post-industrial labor. And I think that is definitely what you see going on in the NFL. You have these people who are participating in public life, right? That is what football is. It's not a typical job. It's a type of work, but it's different than other sorts of work in that it's a big part of our civic life, right? And they have an opportunity to express themselves as good citizens and say, there's a problem with the way that our civic life is coming together here. People like me are being killed.
Yeah, and I think
they're being alienated from that and asked not to express or experience that in a public way. And they're forced into being performers of a certain kind, which is again, a similar kind of alienation.
And of course, there's a racial dimension to this alienation too. If you ask, black men in this case, to present themselves in a public way, but refuse to allow them to express the pain they feel on behalf of themselves and their families and their communities, you're dehumanizing them at the same time. So I think alienation is the right word, absolutely. And I think the more people recognize alienation, the more they can push back against it. But where do we take this insight about the NFL? What does that lead us to next? How do we push back against the alienation, Liz?
I think that maybe one of the most important things to recognize is that everybody on both sides of the equation here is getting screwed. So the players themselves who have a legitimate grievance are being alienated in the sense that they are not able to express themselves in public life, and they're not able to own their sort of being as public citizens here. They're not able to speak or express, however you want to put that. They're alienated in some way from themselves in their role. But on the other hand, as capital comes in and says, like, oh, no, you have to do this patriotic performance. That's something that sells well, and so we're going to enforce it. It's likewise destructive to patriotism. Patriotism is now no different than anything else that can be bought and sold. It's just a commodity. So anyone who actually cared about patriotism, anyone who, and we just passed Memorial Day, anyone who ever cared whatsoever for any kind of patriotism, you also got screwed. Capitalism doesn't care about you either. it's also just selling you something. So I think that there are a lot of people who might consider themselves on different sides of the political spectrum who need to kind of come to a realization that no one's winning here except people who have billions and billions and billions of dollars. Everyone else is losing.
Well, and that is, there again is the contradiction, because they have billions of dollars in this case, or are adding to their billions through the contributions of an audience that may not realize the extent to which they're being alienated in the process of attending a game. And in closing, just about the NFL, I would want to remind listeners and viewers that that they didn't even bring the players on, as I recall, for the national anthem until 2009 or so. So it's not like we're in fact, we didn't recite the national anthem in schools, I believe, until the Eisenhower administration. So it's not as if this performative patriotism is embedded in the DNA of this country. It seemed to be amplified. The more capital, the more finance takes over our national wealth, as opposed to wages of workers and so on, the more we get into this performative patriotism that does not allow ourselves to express ourselves. Is that fair?
I think that makes sense. Yeah, and I think a lot of it also has to do with, again, the way that our foreign policy and the approach we decided to take to financing that has taken over our government. So I know that the Pentagon financed a lot of these NFL patriotism events. There was a Jeff Flake and John McCain oversight report on it. They paid millions and millions of dollars to NFL teams and other professional sports teams to do patriotic displays to help with their recruiting.
No, I think you're absolutely, and I think Blackwater parachuted into a game or something. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks for writing a great piece, Elizabeth Bruenig, opinion columnist for the Washington Post, and thanks for coming on the program and talking about it.
Thanks so much for having me.